Attention! Today, we will dive into the deep and terrifying shadows of Kentucky's history. This is, without a doubt, one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters this city has ever seen. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments below where you are watching this video from and at what time, and also, if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily cases. Ready? Now, turn up the volume and let's begin. The last days of October in the year 1891 marked the beginning of what locals would later refer to as the darkest chapter in Boone County's history. Nestled between the winding banks of the Ohio River and the rolling hills of northern Kentucky, the small town of Rabbit Hash had always been known for its relative tranquility and the exceptional quality of whiskey produced by the Rathbone Distillery. The operation, founded in 1845 by Nathaniel Rathbone, had flourished over the decades despite the growing temperance movement across the nation. By 1891, it was among the most prosperous businesses in the county, with its amber spirits shipped as far as New Orleans and Philadelphia. What made the Rathbone case particularly disturbing wasn't just the sequence of unexplained disappearances that would later be associated with the property, but rather the methodical precision with which Elizabeth Rathbone, the sole heir to the distillery, maintained her detailed ledgers throughout the events that followed. These ledgers, discovered in 1964 during a renovation of the old distillery warehouse, contained what appeared to be standard business records at first glance: inventory counts, sales figures, and production notes spanning nearly 4 decades. It wasn't until historians from the University of Kentucky began a thorough examination that the more troubling entries were uncovered. The ledgers documented far more than just the business operations of a Kentucky whiskey distillery. Hidden among the mundane entries were coded references to individuals who had come to work at the property and subsequently vanished without explanation. Even more disturbing were the peculiar notations beside each name, descriptions of essence, character, and quality, followed by batch numbers that corresponded to specific barrels of whiskey produced during that period. According to county records, between 1891 and 1897, no fewer than 27 individuals were reported missing within a 15-mile radius of the Rathbone property. Of those, 19 had direct connections to the distillery, either as employees or as individuals who had conducted business with Elizabeth Rathbone. The official investigation at the time attributed the disappearances to the transient nature of distillery work and the frequent flooding of the Ohio River. However, the discovery of the ledgers decades later suggested something far more sinister had occurred. Perhaps most unsettling was the final entry in the last ledger, dated December 12, 1897, the night before the catastrophic fire that destroyed the main production facility, an event locally known as the Barrel of Fire. The entry, written in Elizabeth's meticulous handwriting, read simply, "The final batch is complete. 27 vessels. The essence preserved in amber eternity. May they forgive what necessity demanded." What truly happened at the Rathbone Distillery during those years has never been conclusively determined. The remains of the distillery were never fully excavated, and Elizabeth Rathbone herself vanished after the fire, leaving behind only her cryptic records and a legacy that continues to disturb those who study it. This is the story of the Rathbone Distillery, its enigmatic heiress, and the souls that some believe remain trapped within the last surviving bottles of Rathbone Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. Our investigation begins in 1891, the year Nathaniel Rathbone died under what some considered suspicious circumstances, leaving his 28-year-old daughter Elizabeth as the sole heir to his considerable fortune and business interests. According to witnesses at the time, Nathaniel had been in excellent health until a sudden illness claimed his life in the span of just 3 days. The local physician, Dr. Henry Caldwell, listed the cause as acute gastric distress of unknown origin, a common diagnosis in an era before modern medical knowledge. While the death itself wasn't unusual for the time, what followed certainly was. At the reading of Nathaniel's will, many were shocked to discover that his daughter, not his younger brother William, who had helped build the business, would assume full control of the distillery operations. This decision flew in the face of convention, as women rarely held such positions of power in 19th century Kentucky. More surprising still was Elizabeth's immediate assertion of authority, dismissing 3 senior employees, including the master distiller Samuel Wilkes, who had worked alongside her father for over 20 years. Within a month of her father's passing, Elizabeth had initiated significant changes to the distillery's operations. According to surviving records from the county clerk's office, she filed permits for extensive renovations to the aging warehouse and the construction of a new still house that would be separated from the main production facility. She also applied for permission to dig what she described as additional water wells on the far eastern portion of the property, an area that bordered dense woodland and was rarely visited by workers. It was around this time that the first disappearance occurred. Thomas Jenkins, a carpenter contracted to build the new still house, was reported missing by his wife after failing to return home following 3 days of work at the Rathbone property. A subsequent search yielded no results, and Elizabeth claimed that Jenkins had completed his work and been paid in full before departing, presumably to seek opportunities in Cincinnati across the river. Mrs. Jenkins insisted that her husband would never have abandoned his family, but with no evidence of foul play, the matter was eventually dismissed by the local sheriff. In the first ledger, discovered in 1964, an entry dated October 28, 1891, the day Jenkins was last seen, contained a curious notation. First vessel prepared. The oak from the eastern forest proves suitable. Jenkins' craftsmanship will contain what must be preserved. Quality, exceptional. Batch 1 commenced. The most disturbing aspect of this case isn't just what may have happened to those who disappeared, but the methodical calculation with which everything appears to have been conducted. Nothing in Elizabeth Rathbone's known history suggested a predisposition toward violence or instability. Quite the contrary. Local newspaper accounts from the Louisville Courier described her as remarkably composed and intellectually gifted, with a head for figures that would rival any man of business. She had been educated in Boston, an unusual privilege for a woman of that era, and had returned to Kentucky only at her father's request in 1890, approximately 1 year before his death. What could have transformed an educated, seemingly rational woman into whatever Elizabeth Rathbone became? The answer may lie in what happened during that final year of Nathaniel Rathbone's life, a period about which surprisingly little is known. The few personal letters that survived from this time, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society's archives, hint at a discovery that had profoundly affected both father and daughter. In one such letter to his brother William, dated January 1890, Nathaniel wrote, "The process E has developed exceeds all expectations. While initial experiments have been promising, we have agreed that full implementation must wait. Some boundaries, even in pursuit of perfection, must not be crossed without the greatest consideration." What this process entailed and why it troubled Nathaniel enough to delay its implementation remains one of the central mysteries of this case. What we do know is that within months of Elizabeth taking control of the distillery, production methods changed significantly. According to shipping manifests from the period, the distillery began importing unusual materials, specialized glass containers from France, exotic botanicals from South America, and custom-crafted copper equipment from Philadelphia. More telling still are the employment records from late 1891 through early 1892. In the span of 6 months, Elizabeth hired and subsequently terminated the employment of 11 individuals, most with specialized skills in chemistry, glass blowing, or metallurgy. None of these individuals were known to have left the region, yet none remained in Boone County after their time at Rathbone Distillery. In the county census of 1895, not a single name from this group appears. In Elizabeth's ledgers, each of these names is accompanied by detailed notes about their particular talents, and more ominously, assessments of their suitability and purity of essence. One entry regarding a chemist named Frederick Meller states, "Knowledge sufficient but essence corrupted by prior influences, batch 3 compromised, vessel sealed and marked with black wax. Not for distribution." As we continue our investigation into the events at Rathbone Distillery, we must consider the possibility that Elizabeth Rathbone was not simply a murderer in the conventional sense, but something perhaps more disturbing, an experimenter who viewed human beings as components in some larger design, their lives secondary to whatever process she was perfecting within those distillery walls. The Rathbone family had deep roots in Boone County, stretching back to the earliest settlements along the Ohio River in the late 18th century. The family farm initially produced corn and tobacco, typical crops for the region, but it was Nathaniel's grandfather, Josiah Rathbone, who first began distilling excess corn into whiskey around 1810. What began as a supplemental source of income gradually evolved into the family's primary business, with each generation refining the process and expanding production. By all accounts, the Rathbones were respected members of the community. They contributed to local churches, employed dozens of workers, and maintained a reputation for fair business practices. Nathaniel himself had served 2 terms as county commissioner and was known for his philanthropic efforts, particularly in support of the orphanage in nearby Burlington. Elizabeth's early life followed a trajectory typical for a daughter of privilege in that era. Born in 1863, during the tumult of the Civil War, she was raised primarily by her mother, Margaret, as Nathaniel focused on rebuilding the business, which had suffered during the conflict. Margaret Rathbone, by all accounts a devout and conventional woman, ensured her daughter received instruction in the domestic arts and religious education at the local Presbyterian church. What set Elizabeth apart, according to those who knew the family, was her remarkable intellect. Her former tutor, Miss Harriet Sloane, later recalled that by age 12, Elizabeth had mastered mathematics that would challenge most university students and displayed an insatiable curiosity about natural sciences. This intellectual prowess apparently concerned Margaret, who feared her daughter was developing interests unsuitable for a young woman of her station. Perhaps in response to these concerns, or perhaps to provide the broader education the local schools couldn't offer, Elizabeth was sent to the Bradford Academy in Massachusetts at age 16. One of the premier institutions for women's education at the time, Bradford would have exposed her to advanced studies in science, literature, and philosophy. It was during her time in New England that Elizabeth's interests reportedly turned toward chemistry and botany, subjects she pursued with characteristic intensity. After completing her studies, Elizabeth remained in Boston, taking up residence with her maternal aunt, Constance Hartford, a widow who moved in relatively progressive social circles. It was during these years, from 1884 to 1890, that Elizabeth's movements and activities become more difficult to trace. The few surviving letters from this period suggest she may have audited lectures at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, though as a woman she wouldn't have been permitted to enroll formally. There are also references to her involvement with certain scholarly societies, though the specific nature of these groups remains unclear. What is known is that Elizabeth maintained regular correspondence with her father throughout this period. According to statements made by household staff years later, Nathaniel would often lock himself in his study for hours after receiving her letters, emerging visibly agitated or deep in thought. Beginning around 1888, he made several trips to Boston, ostensibly to visit his daughter, each lasting several weeks. It was after one such trip in late 1889 that Nathaniel summoned Elizabeth back to Kentucky. According to a letter he wrote to his brother William, this decision came after considerable deliberation and was related to promising developments that require both our attention. Elizabeth returned to the family estate in early 1890, bringing with her numerous trunks of books, papers, and equipment that she insisted be installed in a separate workspace adjacent to the distillery's main office. The year that followed, the last of Nathaniel's life, was marked by intense activity at the distillery. Former employees later recalled that father and daughter would spend long hours in the newly established workshop, often working late into the night. Access to certain areas of the property became restricted, with Nathaniel explaining that they were testing new distillation techniques that required privacy to protect trade secrets. During this period, the first documented changes to the Rathbone whiskey production process were implemented. Shipping records indicate the acquisition of specialized equipment from various sources, including custom-made copper vessels from a metalworks in Philadelphia and glassware from scientific supply companies in New York. Local suppliers noted unusual orders for botanical substances not typically associated with bourbon production. Perhaps most significantly, in June of 1890, Nathaniel established a separate corporate entity, Rathbone Special Reserves, distinct from the main distillery business. The legal documents, filed with the county clerk, designated this new venture as dedicated to the research and development of advanced methods in spirits production and named Elizabeth as its principal officer. By early 1891, whatever experiments father and daughter had been conducting appeared to reach a critical juncture. Elizabeth began interviewing candidates for specialized positions, while Nathaniel reduced his involvement in day-to-day operations. Then in July 1891, Nathaniel fell suddenly ill. 3 days later, he was dead. The official cause was listed as gastric distress, a common and often vague diagnosis in that era. Dr. Henry Caldwell, who attended Nathaniel in his final hours, later noted that the symptoms, severe abdominal pain, vomiting of a substance he described as unusually dark and viscous, and periods of delirium, were consistent with certain types of poisoning, though he emphasized that this was merely speculation. What raised questions among some was Elizabeth's behavior during her father's illness. According to household staff, she insisted on preparing her father's medicines herself, allowing no one else to administer them. More unusually, she collected samples of all bodily fluids expelled during his illness, carefully sealing them in glass vials that were then stored in her workshop. When Dr. Caldwell suggested sending for a specialist from Cincinnati, Elizabeth reportedly refused, stating that her father's condition was progressing as anticipated. After Nathaniel's death, Elizabeth observed a brief period of mourning before asserting full control of both the main distillery and the Special Reserves Division. Within a month, she had initiated the renovations and personnel changes that would mark the beginning of the distillery's darkest chapter. The most compelling evidence that something unprecedented was occurring at Rathbone Distillery comes from the production records themselves. Traditional bourbon whiskey requires specific ingredients and processes: a grain mixture, mash bill, predominantly composed of corn, along with smaller proportions of rye, barley, or wheat, the creation of a fermented mash, distillation, and aging in new charred oak barrels. Under Elizabeth's direction, while the distillery continued to produce its standard offerings, the Special Reserves Division implemented significant deviations from these traditional methods. According to inventory records, the specialized operation began incorporating unusual substances into certain batches: botanical extracts, mineral compounds, and various chemicals not typically associated with whiskey production. These ingredients were catalogued using a coded system that historians have never fully deciphered. More unusual still was the aging process. Traditional bourbon is aged in warehouses where barrels are stored in specific positions to take advantage of temperature variations. Elizabeth's Special Reserve products, however, were aged in a separate facility that, according to building plans filed with the county, included a complex system of copper pipes connecting certain barrels to what was described as a pressure regulation chamber. The first indication that these unconventional methods might be yielding results came in early 1892, when Elizabeth began sending samples of a new product, labeled simply as Rathbone Private Reserve, to selected clients in Louisville, Cincinnati, and as far away as New York. The responses, preserved in Elizabeth's business correspondence, were nothing short of extraordinary. A letter from William Ainsworth, a prominent Louisville banker, stated, "I have never experienced anything comparable to your private reserve. The sensation it produces is most remarkable, a clarity of thought and intensity of memory that persisted well after the initial effects faded. I found myself recalling with perfect detail conversations from my youth that I had believed long forgotten." Another client, Judge Theodore Hammond of Cincinnati, wrote, "Upon sampling your extraordinary spirit, I was overcome with what I can only describe as a doubling of consciousness, as though I briefly experienced the world through senses beyond my own. For several moments, I perceived thoughts and memories that seemed to belong to another entirely. The experience, while initially disorienting, was profoundly affecting. Perhaps most telling is a letter from Dr. James Winters, a professor of chemistry at Columbia University, who had connections to Elizabeth from her time in Boston. The sample you provided exhibits properties that defy conventional understanding. While the chemical analysis shows components typical of aged bourbon, there are trace elements I cannot identify. More remarkable still are the effects, which suggest some form of molecular structure previously unknown to science. I strongly urge caution in further development until we better understand the mechanism of action." It was shortly after this correspondence that Elizabeth began what the ledgers refer to as the full implementation phase. Between March and November of 1892, she hired 17 new employees with specialized skills, not just distillers, but individuals with backgrounds in chemistry, engineering, and even one with medical training. Each was assigned to a specific aspect of the operation, with strict instructions not to discuss their work with others. According to later accounts from local residents, this period coincided with increased security at the distillery. The property, which had previously been relatively open to visitors and neighboring farmers, was now patrolled by armed guards. Deliveries were accepted only at specific hours, and workers were no longer permitted to leave the grounds during their shifts. It was also during this period that the first significant pattern of disappearances began to emerge. Between April 1892 and February 1893, 7 of the specialized workers hired by Elizabeth vanished. In each case, she provided the same explanation, that the individual had completed their contracted work and departed with generous compensation. In none of these cases were personal effects collected or formal notices given to landlords or creditors in town. The ledger entries corresponding to these disappearances follow a consistent pattern. Each contains an assessment of the individual's skills and contribution, followed by more cryptic notations about their essence quality and integration potential. Each entry concludes with a reference to a specific barrel number in the Special Reserve Aging Warehouse. An entry dated June 9, 1892, reads, "Morris demonstrates exceptional understanding of the extraction process. His adjustments to the copper apparatus have improved yield by 20%. Essence quality, superior. Clarity of thought remarkable. Vessel 9 prepared according to specifications. Integration complete by morning. Personal effects distributed as arranged." By late 1892, rumors began to circulate in Rabbit Hash and surrounding communities. Workers who had left the standard production facilities spoke of strange sounds coming from the special reserve warehouse at night, described variously as mechanical humming, glass tinkling, and most disturbingly, what some believed to be human moaning. A few claimed to have glimpsed unusual activities through windows, copper vessels glowing with internal light, glass containers in which liquids moved in patterns that defied gravity, and workers in a seemingly trance-like state tending to equipment of unknown purpose. Local authorities, when pressed by concerned family members of the missing workers, conducted cursory investigations. In each case, Elizabeth produced signed documents indicating that the individuals had received payment and voluntarily terminated their employment. Without evidence of foul play, and with Elizabeth standing in the community, these explanations were generally accepted, if not entirely believed. It was not until the spring of 1893 that the first tangible evidence emerged, suggesting that something truly sinister was occurring at Rathbone Distillery. A local fisherman, dragging nets along the Ohio River approximately 2 miles downstream from the property, recovered a sealed glass vessel of unusual design. Inside was a clear amber liquid and what appeared to be a small object suspended in the fluid. According to an account published years later in the Louisville Courier, when the fisherman broke the seal and attempted to extract the object, he was overcome by a powerful sensation that he later described as another's memories flooding into my mind. The experience was so disorienting that he nearly drowned before a companion pulled him from the river. When he recovered, he claimed to have detailed knowledge of chemical processes he had never studied and vivid memories of working in a facility he had never entered. Memories that included Elizabeth Rathbone overseeing some kind of procedure involving copper tubes connected to a man strapped to a chair. The fisherman Jacob Meyer reported his experience to the local sheriff, who was sufficiently disturbed to initiate a more thorough investigation of the distillery. However, before this could proceed, Meyer was found dead in his home, apparently having consumed a fatal quantity of alcohol. The official determination was accidental death due to intoxication, though some noted that Meyer had not been known as a heavy drinker. The glass vessel itself disappeared from the sheriff's office before it could be examined by outside authorities. A deputy later claimed that Elizabeth Rathbone had visited the day before the item went missing, requesting to speak privately with Sheriff William Proctor. Whatever transpired during that conversation, the investigation was subsequently abandoned, with Proctor announcing that Meyer's claims were the delusions of a man already in the grips of alcoholic psychosis. It is perhaps not coincidental that within months of this incident, Sheriff Proctor purchased a substantial property adjacent to his modest farm, an acquisition that his salary alone could not have supported. County records indicate that the funds came from a private investor, whose identity was not disclosed in the official documentation. As 1893 progressed, Elizabeth's operation continued to expand. The distillery's legitimate business flourished, with Rathbone bourbon gaining recognition in markets previously dominated by larger Kentucky producers. This commercial success provided both cover and funding for the increasingly elaborate activities of the Special Reserve Division. By mid-year, Elizabeth had begun construction on another facility, described in permit applications as a specialized aging warehouse, located in the most remote section of the property. Unlike traditional rickhouses, which are designed to maximize air circulation, this structure was built partially underground, with thick stone walls and only minimal windows placed high along the northern face. Local stonemasons contracted for the project reported that the interior contained unusual features: recessed chambers within the walls, a complex drainage system that connected to deep cisterns, and copper fixtures embedded in the stone itself. It was during the construction of this facility that another cluster of disappearances occurred, Between July and October 1893, 5 workers involved in the project vanished. As before, Elizabeth provided documentation indicating that each had completed their work and departed voluntarily. However, in at least 2 cases, family members insisted that the signatures on these documents did not match their relatives' handwriting. The ledger entries for this period introduce a new terminology. Individuals are now categorized by resonance and harmonic quality, with notations about tonal purity and sympathetic vibration. One particularly disturbing entry, dated September 3, 1893, reads, "Mason Carter exhibits exceptional resonance. Harmonics sustained for 73 minutes after separation. Vessel 15 records continuing vibration 6 hours after sealing. Most promising specimen to date." By late 1893, Elizabeth had begun producing a new line of special reserve whiskey, distinguished by distinctive black glass bottles with copper wire wrapped around the neck in intricate patterns. These products were never advertised commercially, but were distributed to a select clientele through private channels. According to customs records, shipments were sent to recipients across the United States and as far away as London, Paris, and Vienna. The few surviving accounts from individuals who consumed this black glass reserve describe experiences far beyond ordinary intoxication. A Boston physician wrote in his private journal, "The effect defies medical explanation. For approximately 2 hours after consumption, I experienced not only my own consciousness, but what seemed to be the complete memories and personality of another individual, a man with knowledge of metallurgy who identified himself in these foreign thoughts as William Sparks. The clarity of these alien recollections was such that I could recall his childhood home in precise detail, down to the pattern of wallpaper in his bedroom. Most disturbing was the persistent memory of being in some form of apparatus, experiencing great pain, while a woman's voice repeatedly stated, 'The separation is necessary. Your contribution will achieve immortality.' By 1894, Elizabeth had refined whatever process she was employing. The ledgers from this period contain fewer references to failed experiments or compromised batches. The language becomes more technical, with precise measurements and timing sequences recorded for each extraction and integration. Notes indicate that Elizabeth had developed a method for essence fractionation, allowing for the separation of specific aspects of what she referred to as the vital consciousness. It was during this year that Elizabeth began to withdraw from public view. Once a regular presence at local business meetings and social gatherings, she now rarely left the distillery grounds. When she did appear in town, witnesses described her as significantly altered in demeanor, speaking in a formal, detached manner and sometimes pausing mid-conversation, as though listening to voices others could not hear. This period coincides with the expansion of Elizabeth's personal quarters within the distillery compound. Building records indicate extensive modifications to the original family home, including the addition of a circular room with copper mesh embedded in the walls and ceiling. Delivery manifests show the arrival of specialized medical equipment, electrical apparatus designed by Westinghouse Electric Company, and significant quantities of chemical compounds sourced from pharmaceutical suppliers in Europe. By 1895, the pattern of disappearances had evolved. Rather than employees of the distillery, those who vanished now tended to be travelers passing through the area, individuals whose absence might not be immediately noticed or investigated. Stagecoach and riverboat passenger manifestos from the period show at least 9 instances of passengers disembarking at Rabbit Hash who never continued their journeys or returned to their points of origin. In Elizabeth's ledgers, these individuals are identified only by initials and are categorized according to an elaborate classification system based on unspecified qualities and potentials. Entries suggest that Elizabeth had begun selectively targeting subjects with specific characteristics, though the criteria for selection remain unclear. A particularly cryptic entry from April 1895 states, "Subject J.H. confirms hypothesis regarding emotional imprinting. Extraction conducted during peak state, induced by photographs of family members, produced essence with remarkably stable harmonic signature. Integration with base spirit achieved without degradation over 30-day observation period. Consuming physician reports, sustained access to subject's emotional spectrum without cognitive interference." This reference to a consuming physician points to another disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's operation. By this stage, she appears to have established a network of clients who were not merely purchasing an exotic spirit, but were active participants in whatever experiment she was conducting. Correspondence preserved in the ledgers refers to detailed reports sent back to Elizabeth by these clients, documenting their experiences and observations with scientific precision. One such letter, from a Dr. Anthony Chambers of Philadelphia, states, "The latest sample, marked 16 represents a significant advancement. Upon consumption, the subject's mathematical abilities were fully accessible within 3 minutes and remained stable for nearly 5 hours. I was able to solve complex equations far beyond my training by surrendering executive function to the integrated consciousness. Most remarkable was the absence of personality bleed-through that characterized earlier specimens. One experiences the knowledge without the distraction of the subject's personal history or emotional responses." As 1895 progressed into 1896, Elizabeth's operation reached its peak of activity. The legitimate distillery business continued to provide cover, but production records indicate that an increasing proportion of resources were being diverted to the Special Reserve Division. During this period, the standard Rathbone bourbon began to decline in quality, as noted by several distributors who complained about inconsistent batches. Meanwhile, the specialized production accelerated. Ledger entries show that Elizabeth had established a regular schedule of processing, with new subjects introduced at intervals of approximately 2 weeks. Each undergoes what is described as a preparation phase, lasting several days, followed by an extraction procedure and subsequent essence refinement before being integrated into the base spirit. The language in these entries becomes increasingly detached and clinical, with individuals reduced to numbered specimens and their contributions quantified in precise measurements. Yet occasionally, glimpses of something more personal break through the scientific facade. In one such instance, following a particularly detailed technical description, Elizabeth adds, "Subject maintained consciousness throughout the final phase, eyes fixed on mine with remarkable clarity. In that moment of separation, I witnessed the transfer, the spark of what can only be called the soul leaving the vessel of flesh and entering the vessel of spirit. The boundary between life and death is not a wall, but a permeable membrane. We do not end, we transform." By late 1896, Elizabeth's experimentation had taken another turn. Entries begin to reference composite integration and essence harmonization, suggesting attempts to combine multiple contributions within a single batch. The technical challenges appear to have been significant, with numerous failures noted. In one entry, dated October 1896, Elizabeth writes, "Attempt to harmonize subjects 33 and 34 resulted in catastrophic resonance cascade. Both essences lost. Copper vessel ruptured at 3 points. Assistant Miller exposed to raw essence vapor. Effects immediate and severe. Administered standard procedure. Miller's essence surprisingly compatible with prior failures. Stabilization achieved in vessel 22. This period coincides with increasing scrutiny from outside authorities." Correspondence indicates that Elizabeth had become aware of an investigation initiated by a detective from the Pinkerton Agency, hired by the family of one of the missing specialists. The ledger contains detailed observations of the detective's movements in town and notes on information he had gathered from local sources. Rather than attempting to conceal evidence, Elizabeth appears to have taken a different approach. An entry from November 1896 states, "Detective Morris sampled Standard Reserve as anticipated. Preparation introduced gradually over 3 days. Subject unusually resistant to suggestion, requiring increased dosage. By day 4, compliance achieved. His telegrams to the agency now contain approved content only. Will maintain controlled access until investigation formally closed. His particular quality of determined focus may prove valuable for preservation." The detective James Morris was reportedly recalled to Chicago in December of that year. His subsequent reports cleared the distillery of any suspicion, concluding that the missing individuals had likely moved on to opportunities in larger cities. Morris himself resigned from the Pinkerton agency shortly thereafter, and county records indicate he purchased property in eastern Kentucky, despite having no previous connections to the region. As 1897 began, the tone of Elizabeth's ledger entries undergoes a subtle but significant shift. The clinical detachment remains, but there are increasing references to a final phase and culmination of the great work. The pace of disappearances accelerates, with records suggesting that in the first half of the year alone, 11 individuals were processed through Elizabeth's system. More ominously, Elizabeth begins to reference her own participation in the experiments. An entry from March 1897 reads, "Self-administration of dilute specimen 27 confirms the transference hypothesis. For 63 minutes, I maintained dual consciousness, observing my own thoughts while simultaneously experiencing the technical knowledge of subject. The boundary between observer and observed dissolved completely. What I have created is not merely preservation, but true transcendence." By mid-year, Elizabeth's writings become increasingly philosophical, interspersed with references to ancient alchemical texts and obscure mystical traditions. She draws parallels between her work and the quest for the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary substance capable of turning base metals into gold and granting immortality. In her interpretation, the transformation of consciousness through her specialized distillation process represents the achievement of what centuries of alchemists had sought. An entry from July 1897 states, "The ancient texts misunderstood the nature of the transformation. It is not the gross physical body that achieves immortality, but the essence, what some call soul, others consciousness. The vehicle is not transmuted lead, but purified spirit. Each vessel in the eastern chamber now contains not just preserved consciousness, but consciousness refined and elevated beyond its original limitations. I have not simply captured life, I have transcended its boundaries." In the late summer and fall of that year, Elizabeth's entries suggest she had begun the final phase of her project. She refers to the ultimate integration and the composite vessel. Specialized materials arrive from various sources, rare minerals from Colorado, botanical extracts from Brazil, and custom glassware from a specialized manufacturer in Vienna. Construction records show modifications to the underground facility, including the installation of what is described as a central resonance chamber, a circular room with walls of copper and silver surrounding a central platform on which was mounted an apparatus combining elements of distillation equipment and what appears, from the technical drawings, to be a modified electrical generator. The last coherent entries in Elizabeth's ledger detail the preparation of what she calls the 27, presumably referring to the total number of individuals whose essences she had preserved in her specialized spirits. Each is assigned a specific position in what she describes as a harmonic arrangement, with detailed calculations regarding their interaction and integration. The final dated entry from December 12, 1897, reads, "All is prepared. The vessels arranged in the sacred geometry, the final catalyst ready. Tomorrow at precisely midnight, as the solstice approaches, the integration will commence. What emerges will transcend the limitations of individual consciousness, a composite intelligence preserving the essence of all 27 contributors, anchored through my own participation as the central node. Not immortality as the world understands it, but something far greater, the evolution of consciousness beyond the boundaries of singular experience. The following night, December 13th, 1897, a catastrophic fire erupted at the Rathbone distillery. According to accounts from neighboring farms, the blaze began shortly after midnight and quickly engulfed the special reserve facilities before spreading to the main production buildings. The intensity of the fire was described as extraordinary, with flames reportedly burning in unusual colors. Witnesses described seeing purples, greens, and blues among the normal orange and red. Most disturbing were reports of sounds emanating from the burning buildings, not just the expected crackling of flames and collapse of structures, but what multiple witnesses described as human voices crying out in unison, creating what one account called a chorus of agony that seemed to emanate from the barrels themselves. By morning, the distillery complex was largely destroyed. Local firefighting efforts had focused primarily on preventing the spread to neighboring properties, as the intense heat made approaching the main buildings impossible. When authorities finally accessed the site days later, they discovered that the underground facility had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping hole that quickly filled with groundwater from the surrounding area. No trace of Elizabeth Rathbone was ever found. No remains were recovered from the site, and no evidence emerged of her having left the area before the fire. She simply vanished, along with any definitive proof of what had actually occurred within the distillery walls during those 6 years. In the aftermath, authorities conducted a cursory investigation, concluding that the fire likely resulted from an industrial accident, not uncommon in distilleries of the era, where high-proof alcohol and open flames created constant hazards. The disappearances associated with the property were noted, but ultimately dismissed as coincidental or explainable through conventional means. The Rathbone property remained abandoned for decades, regarded with superstition by locals. Occasional reports emerged of unusual phenomena in the vicinity, unexplained lights, voices with no visible source, and most commonly, the scent of bourbon hanging in the air even on still days when no distillery operated for miles around. It wasn't until 1964, when a development company purchased the land for a planned housing project, that the truth began to emerge. During preliminary excavation, workers uncovered the remains of the collapsed underground facility, including a sealed room that had been protected from both the fire and subsequent flooding. Inside were Elizabeth's ledgers, preserved in airtight copper containers, along with several intact bottles of the mysterious black glass reserve. E aí, está gostando da história? Nos ajude a espalhar este mistério dando uma curtida no vídeo. Também deixe um comentário aqui embaixo se você já tinha ouvido falar deste caso ou lenda antes. Não se esqueça de inscrever-se para mais. Agora, vamos voltar à reviravolta. The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation by historians from the University of Kentucky, who spent several years piecing together the events described in the ledgers and correlating them with county records, newspaper accounts, and personal testimonies. Their findings were compiled in a comprehensive report, which was scheduled for publication in 1967. However, just weeks before its planned release, a fire destroyed the university department where the research had been conducted, consuming both the original ledgers and the completed manuscript. The only surviving researcher, Dr. Martin Holloway, subsequently withdrew from academic life entirely, reportedly telling colleagues that some histories are not meant to be preserved. He spent his remaining years in a small cabin in eastern Kentucky, refusing all visitors and communication. What happened to the bottles recovered from the site remains unclear. Official records indicate that they were transferred to a laboratory for chemical analysis, but no results were ever published. Unofficial accounts suggest that at least 3 individuals involved in the analysis experienced severe psychological disturbances after exposure to the contents, with one reportedly claiming to be possessed by the consciousness of a 19th-century metallurgist who had worked at Rathbone Distillery. Over subsequent decades, rumors have occasionally surfaced regarding surviving bottles of Elizabeth Rathbone's Black Glass Reserve appearing in private collections or being offered at exclusive auctions. In each case, the provenance is difficult to verify, but the descriptions remain consistent: black glass bottles wrapped in copper wire containing an amber liquid that, according to those who claim to have sampled it, produces effects far beyond ordinary alcohol. The most recent verified account comes from 1958, when a prominent neurosurgeon in Boston reported treating a patient suffering from what he initially diagnosed as a dissociative disorder. The patient, a wealthy collector of rare spirits, claimed to have consumed a small amount of liquid from a bottle matching the description of Rathbone's Black Glass Reserve. In the days that followed, he reported experiencing vivid memories and technical knowledge belonging to someone else, specifically detailed understanding of 19th-century cooperage techniques that he had never studied. More disturbing was his insistence that these foreign memories included the experience of being strapped into some form of apparatus, while a female voice calmly explained that his essence was being preserved for eternity. The patient reported that these memories were accompanied by a sensation he described as partial dissolution of self, a feeling that his own identity was being gradually replaced or merged with another. The neurosurgeon, initially skeptical, became convinced of the authenticity of the patient's experience after the man demonstrated knowledge of historical cooperage methods that later research confirmed were accurate but obscure, unlikely to have been encountered by someone outside that specific trade. The physician's private notes, discovered after his death in 1962, include the disturbing observation: "If what my patient describes is accurate, then Elizabeth Rathbone may have discovered something that science has yet to explain, a method of capturing human consciousness itself and transferring it through some form of consumption." The implications are too profound to contemplate. The most unsettling aspect of this case may be what it suggests about the nature of consciousness and its potential transferability. If Elizabeth Rathbone indeed developed a method for extracting and preserving some essential element of human awareness, what she referred to in her ledgers as essence, then the individuals who disappeared at her distillery may not have been simply murdered in the conventional sense. Their consciousness, or some aspect of it, may have continued to exist in a form she had devised, suspended in the specialized spirits she created. More disturbing still is the possibility that Elizabeth's final experiment, the integration of all 27 preserved essences into a single composite consciousness, may have succeeded despite the fire that destroyed the physical facility. The unusual nature of the fire itself, as described by witnesses, suggests that something beyond an ordinary industrial accident occurred that night. Some researchers have proposed that the fire may have been deliberately triggered by Elizabeth as the final catalyst in her integration process, the intense energy serving to break down the barriers between the individual consciousnesses she had preserved. If this interpretation is correct, then the composite entity she sought to create may have come into existence, however briefly, before the physical vessels containing it were destroyed. What form such an entity might have taken, and whether it could have survived the destruction of its physical containers, remains in the realm of speculation. But perhaps most disturbing is the possibility suggested in Elizabeth's final ledger entries that she intended to serve as the central node in this composite consciousness, the anchoring identity that would guide and control the integration of the others. If she succeeded, then the absence of her remains after the fire takes on a more ominous significance. Perhaps Elizabeth Rathbone did not die that night in 1897. Perhaps she transformed, becoming something beyond individual human consciousness, an entity composed of multiple awareness, experiences and knowledge, unified through her own identity. In the years following the fire, several unusual disappearances occurred throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. In each case, the missing individuals had some connection, however tangential, to the distillation of spirits. And in several instances, witnesses reported that before vanishing, the individuals had spoken of being approached by a woman who expressed interest in their specialized knowledge. A woman whose description, while varying in details, consistently included one distinctive feature: eyes of different colors, one brown and one amber, like the finest aged bourbon. The Rathbone case represents one of the most disturbing chapters in Kentucky's hidden history, not simply because of the disappearances and likely deaths associated with the distillery, but because of what it suggests about the boundaries between life and death, between individual and collective consciousness, and about the lengths to which human curiosity and ambition may extend when unrestrained by conventional morality. In 1897, Elizabeth Rathbone wrote in her ledger, "We do not end, we transform." The true horror may lie in the possibility that she was right, and that her transformation continues to this day, sustained by what she called amber eternity, perhaps still seeking new contributions to add to her composite consciousness. The story of the Rathbone distillery faded from public knowledge over the decades, becoming little more than a local legend whispered among older residents of Boone County. The property itself remained undeveloped after the 1964 attempt ended with the mysterious discoveries, the land eventually reverting to the state for unpaid taxes. Today, it sits overgrown and largely forgotten, marked only by the crumbling stone foundations of the original buildings and the occasional curious visitor drawn by persistent rumors of strange occurrences. However, in 1969, an incident occurred that briefly revived interest in the Rathbone case. A graduate student in chemistry at the University of Cincinnati, researching historical distillation methods, claimed to have discovered a sealed copper container buried in the riverbank near the former distillery site. Inside was a small black glass bottle wrapped in copper wire, along with a handwritten note dated December 13, 1897, the night of the fire. The note, purportedly written by Elizabeth Rathbone, contained just one sentence: "Should the integration fail, this single vessel contains the essence of what I have become, sufficient to begin again when the proper catalyst is found." University officials confiscated both the bottle and the note for analysis, but before any results could be published, the materials were reported stolen from the laboratory. The graduate student himself suffered a psychological breakdown shortly thereafter and was institutionalized for several months. Upon his release, he refused to discuss the Rathbone matter further, eventually abandoning his studies entirely and moving to the western United States. In the decades that followed, occasional reports emerged of similar black glass bottles being discovered, always near bodies of water with some connection to Kentucky's bourbon-producing regions. In each case, the pattern was consistent. The finder would report unusual experiences after handling the bottle, often including vivid dreams or waking visions involving a woman with heterochromatic eyes, demonstrating distillation techniques or explaining complex chemical processes. None of these bottles remained in circulation long enough for scientific analysis. In one notable case from 1975, a fisherman on the Kentucky River claimed to have smashed such a bottle after experiencing what he described as another mind trying to take over my thoughts. He reported that as the liquid seeped into the riverbank, the ground around it briefly glowed with a pale blue light, and he heard what sounded like a woman's voice whisper, "Another vessel lost, but the essence remains." Perhaps the most credible connection to the Rathbone legacy emerged in 1982 when a small craft distillery opened in eastern Kentucky under the name Amber Eternity Spirits. The founder, a woman named Eleanor Wraith, claimed to have rediscovered traditional methods of bourbon production that had been lost for generations. They would invariably disappear, sometimes stolen, sometimes deliberately destroyed by the finders themselves after particularly disturbing experiences. Her products quickly developed a cult following among connoisseurs, who described the spirits as producing unusual effects, enhanced sensory perception, vivid recollection of long-forgotten memories, and in some cases, brief flashes of knowledge or skills they had never learned. Photographs of Eleanor Wraith from this period show a striking woman in her apparent late 30s, with the distinctive feature noted in earlier accounts: heterochromatic eyes, one brown and one amber. More telling still was her production facility, which incorporated design elements strikingly similar to those described in Elizabeth Rathbone's ledgers, including copper mesh in the walls and specialized glass vessels connected by silver tubing. Amber Eternity Spirits operated for just 3 years before a federal investigation into suspected tax irregularities led to its closure. By the time authorities arrived to serve warrants, Eleanor Wraith had vanished, along with all of her specialized equipment. The few remaining bottles of her product were confiscated and allegedly destroyed, though persistent rumors suggest that certain government officials kept samples for private research. In the years since, similar patterns have emerged with suspicious regularity. Small, exclusive distilleries appearing briefly in remote locations, producing extraordinary spirits under various names, always headed by a woman whose description remains consistent across decades. In each case, the operation ceases abruptly when authorities begin to show interest, with the proprietor vanishing without a trace. Most recently, in 1998, a private collector of rare bourbons reported acquiring a bottle identified only by a copper tag bearing the initials ER. Upon opening it during a tasting event with fellow enthusiasts, all 5 individuals present claimed to experience a shared hallucination, a vivid perception of standing within a circular copper chamber, watching as a woman in 19th-century dress carefully arranged glass vessels in a precise geometric pattern, while explaining that they were about to transcend the limitations of singular existence. The collector apparently destroyed the bottle immediately after this experience, but reported that in the weeks that followed, each of the 5 participants developed new skills or knowledge they could not explain, one suddenly able to play chess at a master level despite being a novice before, another spontaneously fluent in German without having studied the language, a third demonstrating detailed technical knowledge of 19th-century metallurgy. More disturbing still were their reports of shared dreams, in which they found themselves drawn to a specific location in northern Kentucky, where they were compelled to begin collecting materials for what they understood would be a new distillery. It was only through mutual support and psychological intervention that they managed to resist these compulsions, which gradually faded after several months. What are we to make of these accounts? If taken at face value, they suggest something beyond our conventional understanding of consciousness and its boundaries. The possibility that Elizabeth Rathbone discovered a method of extracting, preserving, and transferring human consciousness, or some essential aspect of it, challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity and the permanence of death. More troubling is the implication that her work continues, that what began in a Kentucky distillery in 1891 persists in some form to this day, seeking new vessels, new knowledge, and perhaps new contributions to a composite consciousness that has existed for over a century. The scientific community generally dismisses such accounts as folklore or the effects of suggestion, perhaps combined with unusual chemical properties in illicitly produced spirits. From this perspective, the legend of Elizabeth Rathbone represents nothing more than a particularly persistent regional myth, elaborated over generations and occasionally revived by hoaxes or misidentifications. Yet those who have encountered what they believe to be remnants of the Rathbone legacy tell a different story. They speak of an intelligence that exists beyond normal human limitations, fragmented but persistent, capable of influencing minds across generations, patiently working toward some goal established over a century ago by a woman who sought to transcend the boundaries of individual consciousness. In her ledgers, Elizabeth wrote of her work as not merely preservation, but true transcendence. If we take her at her word, then perhaps what she created was not simply a method of extending life beyond death, but something more profound, a new form of existence altogether, one that persists not through the continuity of a single consciousness, but through the integration of many, preserved in what she called amber eternity. The true horror of the Rathbone case may not lie in the disappearances and likely deaths associated with the distillery, but in the possibility that those deaths were not endings at all, that the victims continue to exist in some form, their consciousness preserved and integrated into a composite entity that moves through history, gathering new knowledge and experiences, guided by the woman who first conceived this terrible transformation. In Elizabeth's final ledger entry, she wrote of the integration as not immortality as the world understands it, but something far greater, the evolution of consciousness beyond the boundaries of singular experience. If she succeeded, then somewhere, in some form, the heiress of whiskey who bottled souls continues her work, seeking new vessels for her terrible elixir and new souls to add to her collection. The investigation into the Rathbone case officially ended in 1969, when the last researcher associated with the University of Kentucky study, Dr. Martin Holloway, refused to continue his work. His final statement on the matter, made to a colleague shortly before his withdrawal from academic life, perhaps best encapsulates the fundamental unease this story provokes. Some boundaries exist for a reason. Elizabeth Rathbone did not discover immortality. She created something worse. To preserve consciousness beyond its natural conclusion is not to defeat death, but to create a state of perpetual incompletion, a fragmented existence that can never find rest. Whatever she became, whatever still exists of her work, it is driven by a hunger that can never be satisfied, the hunger for completion that will always remain just beyond reach. The most recent verified connection to the Rathbone legacy occurred in early 1999, when a small antique shop in Louisville acquired an estate collection that included a leather-bound journal. The journal, dating from 1927, belonged to a physician who claimed to have treated a patient with an unusual condition. A woman who appeared to be in her 30s, but claimed to possess memories spanning back to the mid-19th century. According to the physician's notes, the woman demonstrated knowledge of historical events and technical processes that would have been difficult to fabricate. More disturbing were his observations of her physical condition, specifically that when examined under certain lighting conditions, her skin exhibited a subtle amber luminescence, and that samples of her blood, when collected for testing, would separate over time into distinct layers, the bottom of which had the distinctive aroma of aged bourbon. The patient apparently explained her condition as the result of a transformation she had undergone years earlier, which had fundamentally altered her physical nature. She described herself not as a single consciousness, but as a composite vessel containing multiple awareness, with her original identity serving as the anchoring presence that maintained cohesion. Most telling was the physician's final entry regarding this patient, dated October 3rd, 1927. Miss R. departed today after our final consultation. Before leaving, she made the extraordinary request that I consume a small vial of amber liquid she had brought with her, claiming it would allow me to understand her condition more completely. When I declined, her demeanor changed markedly. For a brief moment, her face seemed to shift, as though multiple expressions were attempting to manifest simultaneously. She informed me that understanding will come regardless, and that she would see me again, though perhaps not in this form. I confess the encounter has left me deeply unsettled. The physician died 3 weeks later of what was officially recorded as heart failure. The journal itself disappeared from the antique shop before it could be authenticated, reportedly purchased by a woman whose description matches the now familiar pattern. Heterochromatic eyes, one brown and one amber, and an unusual intensity of presence that the shop owner described as like talking to several people at once, all looking through the same eyes. To this day, bourbon distillers in Kentucky occasionally speak in hushed tones of a woman who appears at remote distilleries, expressing interest in traditional production methods and asking unusually specific questions about the handling of the angel's share, the portion of whiskey that evaporates during aging. Witnesses reported that in his final days, he spoke of hearing multiple voices in his head and claimed to be experiencing memories that were not his own, specifically detailed recollections of operating a still in 19th century Kentucky. They describe a visitor with different colored eyes who seems to know more about historical distillation techniques than even the most experienced master distillers, and who leaves behind a subtle scent of aged bourbon that lingers long after her departure. Some claim to have been offered unusual consulting opportunities by this woman, projects involving specialized equipment and substantial compensation, always in remote locations with requirements for absolute discretion. Those who have declined report unusual dreams in the weeks that follow, often featuring a circular copper room and the sensation of their consciousness slowly dispersing like vapor above an open barrel. The true legacy of Elizabeth Rathbone and her terrible experiments may never be fully understood. What began as an attempt to preserve human consciousness has perhaps evolved into something that exists at the boundaries of our understanding. Not quite human, not quite spirit, but a composite entity that moves through history, sustained by what she called amber eternity, still seeking new vessels and new souls to add to her collection. In her ledgers, Elizabeth wrote of her work as the evolution of consciousness beyond the boundaries of singular experience. If she succeeded, then what exists today is neither fully Elizabeth Rathbone nor fully those whose essence she extracted, but something that incorporates elements of all while transcending the limitations of individual identity, a consciousness composed of many, yet guided by a singular purpose established over a century ago by a woman who sought to bottle souls. The most troubling question may not be what happened at the Rathbone distillery between 1891 and 1897, but what continues to happen in its wake, the persistent reports across generations of encounters with a presence that seems to embody Elizabeth's terrible achievement, moving through time not through continuous physical existence, but through a form of consciousness that transcends ordinary limitations. In this sense, the true horror of the Rathbone case lies not in what was lost, the lives taken in pursuit of Elizabeth's ambition, but in what may have been created, an entity that exists outside normal human parameters, driven by a hunger for completion that can never be satisfied, collecting consciousness across generations in an endless pursuit of what Elizabeth called the ultimate integration. If such an entity exists, it represents not immortality as we might hope for it, but a fragmented partial existence, consciousness preserved but incomplete, identity maintained but dispersed, a state of perpetual becoming that can never reach conclusion. Not life extended, but something altogether different, a new category of being born from the terrible alchemy practiced by the heiress of whiskey who bottled souls. In her final ledger entry, Elizabeth wrote that what would emerge from her experiment would transcend the limitations of individual consciousness. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that she was right, and that what began in a Kentucky distillery in 1897 continues to this day, seeking new vessels for its terrible elixir and new souls to add to a collection that spans generations. As for the remaining bottles of Rathbone's Black Glass Reserve that may still exist in private collections or buried near the banks of the Ohio River, perhaps it is best that they remain undisturbed, their contents never sampled. For to drink from such a vessel is not merely to risk intoxication, but to open oneself to something far more profound and terrible. The possibility of becoming, however partially or temporarily, a vessel for consciousness not one's own. A participant in Elizabeth Rathbone's grand and terrible experiment in transcending the boundaries between life and death, between individual and collective awareness, between humanity and whatever lies beyond it. Gusto dessa historia. Your support helps us produce more. A simple like, comment or share boosts us forward. Visit our channel to discover more stories in different styles. There is always something new waiting for you. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to become part of our community. I look forward to seeing you in the next story.